let's now look at the using the work of internal auditor. Why do you think that the auditor is going to use the work of the internal auditor? Right, now let's look at this. Who are internal auditors? What is the relationship between internal auditors and the internal auditor, the external and the internal auditor relationship? Yeah, right. And I do not know, some of you here might have actually taken a course on the internal audit. Yeah, right. So those who have taken internal audit, maybe you can, maybe when I explain, you know what I mean. Huh? Right. So you can see here that the standard only is from the requirements, section 15 until section 37. Section 14 is about the definition. Right, let's look at the definition of the internal auditor, if there is a. Tak ada. Internal audit function, itu je, the internal auditor tak ada, but internal audit function. Okay, internal audit function, a function of an entity that performs assurance and consulting activities designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and internal control processes. If you would like to know more about internal audit function, I have actually shared a YouTube that I covered that I have covered for the internal audit function, the introduction part. So maybe you can refer to that. Right. So here, when we say internal audit function, this is a function. That means it will be carried out by the internal auditors. And who are internal auditors? Now, internal auditors can be internal. That means the employee of the entity or the client company, or they can be the external. The internal auditor can be external to the client company. In other words, it means that the client may hire the internal auditor. So when hired, they are going to become, they are going to be employed. So they become employee. In another or second situation, the auditor get the service of this internal auditor. And from where? From the audit firm juga lah, from the accounting firm. So the auditor who is going to audit this client company may also become internal auditor, but not to the same client company, to the other company. To other company. So one auditor is an external auditor to one client, but can also be internal auditor to another client company. I hope you understand that particular statement. So that means the internal audit function can be carried out by the employees within the client company or by the audit firm or accounting firm outside the client company that come to the client company to provide the service. And this internal audit function is actually mandatory. It's mandatory. It's required by the regulation. So previously it was not required, but now it's required due to several circumstances. One is actually due to the scandal, due to corporate scandal, where there are many firms now, many companies now that are involved in fraudulent reporting. So the use of internal audit function would actually trying to curb, trying to reduce the occurrence of the fraud occurring within a company. Yeah? And the internal audit function, one of the duties of the internal auditor would be to carry out the assessment and the evaluation of the internal controls. So one internal audit function would be to assess and evaluate the internal controls of the client, because the occurrence of fraud usually associated with the internal controls. Good internal controls or adequate, strong would reduce the occurrence of fraud occurring. Yeah. So if the internal controls are weak, then the possibility of fraud to occur is going to be higher. Yeah. Right. So what is actually the interest of the external auditor in using the work of the internal auditor? Yeah. Okay, let's look at this. I just wanted to summarize. Maybe you can refer to this later on your own. Okay, remember auditor, external auditor. When we talk about external auditor, the audit engagement team has to has to carry out audit on the client company. And one area that the external auditor is going to cover would be in relation to the client's internal controls. If you remember your audit one, the auditor has to plan. And then after that, the auditor has to carry out the plan. First of all, the auditor is going to carry out the audit procedures on the internal control. Or we say to carry out or to perform tests of controls. And once the test of controls had been performed, the auditor is going to proceed with the substantive test. Okay? So therefore here, there are two types of audit procedures, two main type of audit procedures or two main type of tests that the auditor has to carry out. One is the test on the internal controls of the client. Then after that, the auditor is going to carry out substantive tests, which is on the financial information. So there is a relationship there between internal control and the financial information. Yeah. Good internal controls indicate financial information of client is likely to be reliable. For a weak internal controls of the client, it's likely that the information, the financial information of the client is going to be less reliable. Okay? So you can see here that there is a relationship. Yeah? Direct relationship, good internal control, high reliability financial information. Yeah? So it means that the work of, the test of the internal controls here are very important. And who will usually do this? In most organizations, this will be carried out by the internal auditor, because one of the functions of the internal audit would be to carry out assessment and evaluation of the internal controls. Okay. Because why internal controls? will the internal control, okay? Good internal control will ensure that the the effectiveness, yeah, will improve the effectiveness, yeah, or will make the effectiveness of the entities risk management and internal control. Sorry, uh, good internal controls will ensure that the client achieve the objective. Yeah, achieve the objective. Achieve the objective would be what? That means meet the objective, for instance, increase profit figure, safeguard of the asset, compliance to the rules and regulation, yeah, and then efficient and effective production, uh, and then also including adherence to the rules and regulation, yeah, and so on. So you can see that good internal controls will ensure that the entities governance are in place, the risk management are considered, and the internal control processes are adequate. Yeah, so that is actually the purpose of assessing the internal control. Yeah, assessing the internal control and evaluating. So when we say assessing the internal control and evaluating the internal control, it means that the internal control, if there are weak internal controls, then the internal auditor is going to disclose this to the management, and the management will be suggested to improve the internal controls. Yeah? The management has the management is suggested by internal auditor to improve on the internal control, so that uh, whatever loopholes that relate to the internal controls can be covered, so that the objective of the company can be achieved. So back to this one here, back to the work of the internal, back to the work of the external auditor. The external auditor, remember I said just now, has to carry out tests of control. So that means to assess, evaluate the internal controls of the client. And this also had been done by the internal auditor. So you can see that there will be duplication of the audit work. Okay? And this is going to be costly to the management, to the client company. So what happened would be that because external auditor knew that the assessment evaluation of internal controls are being carried out by the internal auditor, so the external auditor may consider to use the work to use may consider to use the internal auditor. Okay? May consider to use the work of the internal auditor, so that whatever information gathered by internal auditor can be used by the external auditor. So this therefore reduce the work of the external auditor. If reduce the work of external auditor, it means that also reduce the fees paid to the external auditor. Yeah, because the scope of work now is going to be limited with respect to the internal control. However, before auditor is going to, the external auditor is going to rely on the work of the internal auditor, the external auditor has to evaluate the internal audit function. Whether the function carried out by the internal auditor here cover the area that the external auditor is going to use. Yeah. So usually what happens is that similar to the expert, preferably before the internal auditor carry out the work on the internal controls, the external auditor will meet with the internal auditor and discuss the area that should be covered by the internal auditor. Yeah. There might be, in general, okay, the general area that should be covered maybe is understandable, but there might be certain area which if external auditor would like to get evidence, and this has to be specified, yeah, in the agreement to the internal auditor that they have to cover this particular area. Yeah. So you can see that here the evaluation. The external auditor shall determine whether the work of the internal audit function can be used for the purpose of the audit by evaluating the following: the extent to which internal audit function, organization status, and relevant policies, procedures support the objectivity of the internal auditor. Okay. So in other words, that the external auditor is going to evaluate the work of the internal auditor, but preferably they should come into agreement. Yeah, the external auditor and internal auditor should come into agreement what they have to cover, so that at least the work of the internal audit, the work of the internal auditor would be useful to the external auditor. Yeah, and then secondly, competency. Well, we say the external expert just now, obviously they are going to be competent lah, yeah. An external auditor may not hire not competent expert. Yeah? But with regard to the internal audit, the use of the work of internal auditor, we do not know the level of competency of the internal auditor, because these are hired by the client, not by the external auditor. So before going to use the work of internal auditor, the external auditor has to evaluate on this. Because this play the role here to determine whether how strong the internal controls of the clients are. Whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach. Yeah? So this one again has to be evaluated. If it is not systematic, not disciplined, that means there is a possibility that the financial information of the client company may not be reliable. Yeah? So these are, some of the things that need to be evaluated by the external auditor. Okay, will the external auditor consider the independent status of the internal auditor? Yeah, I repeat, will external auditor evaluate the independent status of the internal auditor? Okay, the issue here is no issue about independence, because you know that internal auditor provides service to the client, and obviously the internal auditor would be favoring the client. Yeah, clear about that. Unlike the external expertise just now. All right. So the external auditor shall not use the work of internal audit function if the external auditor determine that the functions, organizational status, and relevant policies and procedures do not adequately support the objectivity of the internal auditor. The function lacks sufficient competence. The function does not apply a systematic and disciplined approach, including quality control. So it goes back to this one here. If auditor cannot rely on this, then that means auditor has to limit the use of the work of the internal auditor. Yeah. Okay, the rest would be I want you to read yourself. Yeah. So what is important here? What is important here is that remember when we discuss this topic, the issue is that the external auditor um, can use the work of the internal auditor. Right? Can use the work of internal auditor because the external auditor has to carry out tests of control, and this assessment evaluation of the internal controls are actually also carried out by the internal auditor apart from other functions lah. Yeah? So therefore the external auditor um, may consider the work of this internal auditor, but must evaluate first whether the work by the internal auditor can be relied or cannot be relied. Yeah, because if can be relied, it means that the external auditor may, when they are going to carry out the test of control, they can limit the test of control. The external auditor still will have to carry out the test of control, but they are going to limit now, yeah, because they can actually rely on the work of the internal auditor. And the opposite would be true lah. If let's say the work of internal auditor is not going to be reliable, then the external auditor is going to carry out their uh, test of control on the client company as what they have actually planned earlier lah. Yeah? That means going to be carried out sufficiently in detail, yeah? Addressing the areas where the control risks are higher. All right. So that means when come to evaluation, that means the external auditor is going to look at how reliable, whether competency, whether sufficient information provided, and so on. So that's all actually about the use of the internal auditor. Yeah. Using the work of the internal auditor. All right, everybody. So this one, the rest, I want you to read yourself. Yeah.